Good morning. Good noon if you're on the East Coast. Thanks for joining us for today's Saturate webinar. This is the third of four Gospel and Politics webinars that we're doing this summer. And this is one that we plan to kind of zoom out from the current moment in US culture, US history, and consider the reality globally in many places and the future that the US is headed toward, which is this question: how do Christians, how do churches engage and equip for politics when politics moves beyond Christendom? Kind of the Christendom being the culture that kind of reflects and echoes Judeo-Christian values, and as cultures move from that into more pluralism or less overtly echoing Judeo-Christian values, we say we're moving into post-Christendom. And so how does the church engage and equip our people? And what can mission and ministry look like as we move increasingly beyond Christendom? And some of this stems from this common conversation that I remember having with folks in the US at every presidential election, which is something along the lines of which candidate is the most Christian, quote unquote. And what's often meant by that is which candidate's public platforms at least line up with what I believe the Bible to teach. And if we dig in a little bit, we know there's some problems with that. First, Christianity is not about values, but it's about a relationship, a faith in a person, not just a certain way to live. Certainly that person teaches us how to live and models and equips us for that life, but Judeo-Christian values isn't enough. The second problem is that every platform and every candidacy has some echoes of values that we see in the Bible, but often at the expense of other values we see in the Bible. And finally, in a very real way, if we were really honest, there are some candidates in every election that even cater to a Christian audience, whether out of integrity or simply to get votes. And that still happens in many places across the US. It still happens in some places across the world. But in a lot of the world, and even in some places in our own country, that's not the reality. Christian values is far from being a priority for leaders. The shaping message, candidates shaping a message for the church is not common. And in much of the world, society is at least pluralistic or secular, if not agnostic. In much of the world, they're already post-Christendom or pre-Christendom maybe, and so their politics reflect that. And so that's the foundation for this conversation. The last thing I'll say before we kind of jump in is that while those truths may be new for some folks in the US looking to the future, it's not an inherently like fatalistic or negative thing. It's not inherently bad. Stuart Murray, who's a British sociologist who will be on one of our webinars in the fall, actually says that the move from Christendom to post-Christendom is an opportunity for Christians to realize our misplaced hope in the government, for the church to truly be the church, and then to engage the society around us with the witness of Jesus. And so today's webinar is looking at kingdom work when politics are secular. I've got great guests to help with that from a few different cultures. For some of you, when you signed up, Gord Fleming was on the docket, and there was miscommunication that I need to own on my part, and Gord had to back out. But we are thrilled for Chris Synesael, who's a pastor in Victoria, BC. That's in Canada for us Americans who don't know where British Columbia is.
Barely in Canada.
Barely in Canada, yeah. It's almost America, but it's a beautiful island it is just fantastic. Atanasio Segovia was raised in the US. He leads Familia Soma in Leon, Mexico now, and is doing some great work in Mexico. And then Brad Watson is a familiar face and voice to much of the Saturate audience, but some of you may not know that he spent a good portion of his upbringing in Portugal. And so he brings that perspective into this conversation as well. So 3 perspectives, 3 nations, to help us think through the future reality of the US. So I'll pray, then we'll have a conversation for a bit, and then we'll answer some of your questions. So feel free to post those throughout. Father, would you meet us here Would you remind us that you are the one true King? Would you remind us that you are sovereign, that you are the one who puts governors and kings and rulers in places, God, and you do that for human flourishing. You do that also because government's a human entity, as we experience it at least. You also do it to remind us of the brokenness that exists within humanity. And in some moments, you choose governors and kings. You did this in Israel. You do this in other countries. To point us back to you and realize our need for you above any human leader. And so I thank you that we get to enter this conversation with confidence in you as our one true and ultimate ruler. And I just pray that as we have conversations about human rulers and politics and society and government and this kind of stuff, that you would make this an act of worship and keep our eyes focused on you through it all, in our desperate need for you in this country and in others. We thank you and we praise you and pray that this will be an act of worship and glory to you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
So thanks for joining us, gentlemen. Let's start with just a little bit of context. I gave the one sentence intro of you. For folks who don't know you, is there any other context or insight on who you are that would be helpful, or maybe even what you're excited for in this conversation?
Yeah, I'm excited to have this conversation with you all. Maybe some other context might be I've only pastored in places where Christianity is nominal, or a super minority of the culture at large, and so that's another. It's not just I grew up in a place that was different, but also that's been my experience as a pastor. But then before that, my first 2 times to vote in American elections, first 3 times really, if you count midterms, was in Oklahoma. So that was a whole different political environment. So
next time we do this, we should give you 3 different sets of glasses, and you can have like Portugal Brad talking to West Coast Brad, and that would be really enthralling.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, thanks. That's a really good context. Either you other guys?
Yeah, for us, for those who don't know Canada well, like we're as far left on the Canadian map as you can go. We are below the 49th parallel, so I was only half joking. We're like, right around Kirkland, Washington. We draw a straight line over from Kirkland, Washington, but we are a provincial capital. So in British Columbia, the provincial capital here is on the island. So government is a huge part of the ethos of our culture. It's one of the more significant employers in our city. The other reality is very, very secular city. These are stats I used to drag out when I was raising money to church plant. So I don't know how true they are because that was 10 years ago, but one of the least church cities in North America, I think outside of Francophone Quebec. About 3% of our church, or city rather, would be in a church gathering, 3 to 5% probably now. And that, obviously includes all sorts of churches, denominations, and relies heavily on people's, guilt when they fill out the Canadian census stuff. So it is a pretty secular city. Politics is definitely a part of the fabric of our city. So, and I think, just in the moment we find ourselves in, this is a super necessary conversation. If you spend more than 5 seconds on social media, like, you cannot avoid politics. It's just there.
Cool. Awesome. I can give you a little background as well. So I grew up in the Bay Area, definitely not a Christian area in the States. That's also where the Lord called me first. I was born in Mexico, but I grew up in the States. I also got to feel the tail end of it, of seeing a large block of evangelical Christians vote, and got directly impacted several times in my life. So I got to experience that. Moving to Mexico, I got to vote for the first time, I don't know, a few months ago. No, yeah, about a year ago. And it was pretty cool because I was like, hey, where's a Christian candidate? But I realized I was in another country. I'm kind of like in the most religious area of Mexico. The U.S. has the Bible Belt. I'm in the Catholic belt of Mexico, so even it's very different from the rest of the country. So, you know, it's been interesting to navigate from, you know, secular Bay Area to like super religious Leon, the city where I live now. So it's been interesting to see it all unfold.
Yeah. I love these different perspectives. It's going to be a good conversation we're going to get to have. Continue with some context. Explain a little bit about what is the relationship of the government in the country. Brad, you can pick which country you talk about. The relationship of the government to the church or to Christianity. In the States, where officially, you know, church and state is separate, and yet there seems to be so much overlap still. So yeah, what would you describe as the relationship between those two entities?
Just jump in.
Go for it.
Yeah, well, I would say, you know, and COVID maybe even accelerated or at least exposed this, that in Canada, generally, this is like, everything's going to be general that we're saying here, right? It generally revealed that there isn't one. That the government doesn't really see or place a high value on the church. And so it was very easy and has remained easy for them to, you know, and I'm not waving a, you know, persecuted flag here. I don't think there's malicious intent. I just don't think that the government has seen an intrinsic value in the church, or, you know, like down in the States, you know, there's the conversation of, is the church an essential service? That's not even on the radar here. And so one of the things I think that COVID exposed was that the government doesn't really have a huge place for the church. And some of that's on us because we haven't done our job as the church of, you know, making disciples and living out Jesus's mission and bringing the kingdom to bear. But there's this reality that we have to face that when it comes to election time, there is not, you know, a pandering to the evangelical vote, if you will. Politicians, generally speaking, are not appealing to any sort of faith background. We're very multicultural. We're very diverse. Those are like sort of the highest ideals or values in our context. And in some ways well, not in some ways, I think in every way, if you were to try and pander to a Christian vote, like a specifically like, you know, evangelical vote, it would be political suicide in Canada. It would not do you any favors. So that's kind of the relationship. It's in some ways non-existent, I would say. I can talk more about that, but I don't want to take up too much time.
Yeah. Let me ask you one follow-up on that before these other two guys go. If they're not pandering to evangelicalism, do candidates even discuss personal faith? And if so, whether it's Christian or Muslim or anything, and if so, what's kind of the response if they do?
They don't.
Okay.
No, not really. Not at all. I'm just trying to think if that's, you know, if we have any pictures of politicians awkwardly holding up Bibles in photo shoots. Sorry, I'm gonna take some shots if I can. You know.
Hey, we gave you a platform. You can take shots at America all you want.
I can't think of that. In fact, I can imagine. You know, and again, we have political spectrum here in Canada as well. It's definitely shifted way more left than the American spectrum is. But on the, you know, some of our more left-leaning politicians would actually, and I'm not, again, I just want to apologize because I'm Canadian, so I'm not saying this out of like, you know, feeling slighted in any way, but our politicians in some ways would pander, if you want to use that word, to other religions. Like we have a large East Indian, you know, community, especially here in British Columbia, but I know in Toronto and other parts of the country as well. And so you see our politicians participating in their religious festivities and some of their cultural celebrations, but not, you know, you will get a classic canned political tweet speech, you know, at Christmas and Easter, but even those would be very diverse, very inclusive of all faiths and all traditions, and not uniquely Christian in any way.
Yeah. So at best, if you know anything about a politician's faith, it's because someone took a picture of them at a celebration or this kind of stuff. It's not talked about. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. What about you other two guys? What's the intersection or not of government and church?
Growing up, I'm curious how similar it might be to Leon, but growing up in Lisbon, Portugal, the churches, well, I guess the church growing up was the Catholic Church. That's what, I mean, that's what it meant. It meant a universal, if you're in following the popes, the line of Peter's church. And that connection with the government was really, really strong. There was a dictator where that relationship with the church was like one and the same for about 60, 70 years. And then in their revolution, it became a little bit more separate, but it was still like no one got elected who wasn't Catholic. And then for evangelicals, or what we would probably describe as evangelicals, evangelicalism is kind of just an American thing also. It's just like a side note. But people who are, professing the gospel, evangelism, baptism, Protestants, I guess, they were not a recognized church. So if you got married in a Baptist church or a Pentecostal church or something like that, you'd have to get remarried in the courthouse or the government. The same was even for funerals. If a funeral was overseen by a priest could like fill out a death certificate. If your funeral took place somewhere else, you still had to do a different death certificate with the government because an evangelical minister wouldn't count. And so that was kind of the relationship growing up. I hardly ever heard anyone talk about politics in church. I heard a lot of international politics related to how the world is working together, about wars. Usually it was about like, what is America doing? Why are they messing up? So I think that would be how I experienced politics growing up. And even to that point, like you would see, politicians going to mass, coming out of mass, lobbying for the Pope to come visit because it was big for the economy. But all of that was on the surface, beneath just a cultural kind of reality. And then beneath that, people just lived their lives. So it wasn't like I had zero friends that went to mass regularly. Didn't know any families that participated in anything beyond catechism. Even my generation, very few did First Communion even at all. And so I think that's, so it was a pretty secular society underneath this like cultural reality, which, to put my other hat on, wasn't that different than living in Oklahoma. So I'll just leave that out there. So
yeah, that's deep, and gets kind of touchy because I'm in Texas, which is very dissimilar to Oklahoma.
Yeah, so. I was also a youth minister in Houston, so yeah, it's not very different either.
Yeah, that's right. And that's an interesting point because in opposition to how Chris kind of talked about the lack of any kind of faith statement, what you're saying is in Portugal it was almost required it was required to be a member in good standing. But yeah, and I have a close friend who grew up in France, not saying Portugal's France, but like he said, as he grew up, he was French Catholic atheist.
Mm-hmm.
And that any kind of use of the church in something like what we're talking about today, politics or election or dictatorships or whatever else, was merely a culturally expected platform, not necessarily a grounding in biblical belief.
Yeah. Definitely. Yeah. And even one of the ways that, the politics is also different government structures. So we had a president instead of a king or a queen, and then a prime minister. But the president, all growing up for me, who got reelected over and over again, one of the ways that he actually won points politically was talking badly about evangelical Christians, saying it was a religion for immigrants and gypsies. And that would be a line that he would repeat a lot to show people like, no, I'm not going to change our culture, which is like prevalent throughout Europe. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in Mexico is very similar to what Brad and Chris are describing. First of all, it would be political suicide for any candidate to discuss faith. They're not supposed to. And also, when you talk about the church in Mexico, you're not talking about, evangelical Protestants. You're talking about the Catholic Church. And historically, Mexican history shows there's been like a real power struggle that's led to an actual war between church and state. So it's a very, very secular country. You're not supposed to mix both of them. Even the Constitution talks about that. Priests and now pastors are not supposed to talk about politics or endorse a particular candidate. You're just not supposed to do that. The way that impacts a small 5 to 7% evangelical Protestant Christians in Mexico is that I was talking to some of my friends. They're not looking for character in any of the potential candidates. They're not looking for anyone, as Chris said, to hold up the Bible. That's not even in our grid or framework. It just doesn't make sense. Comparing that to how I grew up in the States, it almost felt like Christians were outsourcing Christianity to government to implement it, whereas I don't see that here at all. That's not a possibility. So anyways, there's a clear distinction, dividing line, to a point where when you get married by, civil law, that you do that according to the government, but technically you haven't done it in the eyes of God. So you have to go to the Catholic Church to do that, and out to a pastor. That otherwise, the church won't recognize your marriage, or if you just get married in church, the government won't recognize your marriage. So there's a clear line of secular and the church.
Mm.
So in that case, both with kind of the, there's kind of two extremes. One is there's no public acknowledgement of faith, much less Christianity as one faith. And on the other hand, there is a very public, requirement, even though it's not, necessarily lived out. It's just a cultural platform. I recognize the question I'm about to ask based on that is a very like Americanized democratic values kind of question, but how do Protestants in those cultures decide who to vote for? Because again, like right now in the U.S., kind of the best way they know to vote is who's going to be the most Christian candidate, or who's going to put most Christian values, again based on whatever they hold to convictionally most, who's going to put those back in the ruling seat. So how is it possible that Christians can be involved in countries where that's not a reality?
Yeah, so I can answer this through two lenses. One is kind of my general sense of the pulse of like the people I pastor and just the Christian community at large in Canada, and then my own personal take. And I would say it's probably helpful to recognize that in Canada, we have a multi-partied system, not two parties, but there are only two parties that have ever been elected, the Liberals and the Conservatives. And whereas in the United States, it seems like those two parties are very far apart, in Canada, they're not that far apart. They're actually quite close, and there's some fiscal differences and a few things like that, but yeah, they're not nearly as polarized, and so there is a lot of jumping back and forth. You're not tied to a political ideology with your faith in the same way that you are in America. However, as I often say, when the United States sneezes, Canada catches a cold. So there is that reality here in Canada that there are a number of Christians who feel like a vote for a particular party, in our context, it would be the Conservative Party, is a Christian vote. And so there is that small segment, that small slice of the church that does that. But then there's also, figure this one out, and I'm sure this is becoming more and more true south of the border as well. There is a small slice of the population that would say that to vote for the Conservative Party would actually be an anti-Christian vote. So try and figure that one out. And so I would say that there is not necessarily that same tie But here's how I feel. Like, and I don't know. This is a pretty raw, unfiltered thought, so we can round it out or delete this if we need to. But I just feel like every Christian should feel politically homeless. I know I personally feel very politically homeless. And I kind of vote and feel like I need to take a shower after, to be perfectly honest, because I just cannot wrap my mind around a kingdom ethic and a political ideology that fully align. It just doesn't exist. And I think one of the I don't know if redemption is the right word, but one of the things that's coming out of this intensely politically charged moment we find ourselves in is that is becoming more and more the case. People are recognizing that, man, nothing on the table here reflects the gospel of Jesus. So for me personally, that's how I feel. I would say within the church in Canada, it's all over the map, and people are going to try and find something that they can somehow reconcile with their Christian ethic. But then if you go back and listen to the previous webinar that Chris Gonzalez hosted, what you're going to find is that there just isn't a political ideology that fits with a kingdom ethic. In fact, it's quite dangerous to tether those two things together, like extremely dangerous, potentially demonic.
Yeah, that's good.
You're going to end on the word demonic, Chris, and just mic drop it there. Good. Go ahead, Brad. You were going to say something.
Oh yeah, no, I think that's how both in Portugal and then I'd say every time I've voted or participated in the process in America has felt that way as well. Where you feel really homeless. I think growing up, our church was made up of people that belonged to the Communist Party, believe it or not, people that belonged to the very conservative party that his roots was kind of like in the dictatorship, people that were former colonizers in Africa. It was such a diverse melding of people, and then many people that didn't have the right to vote because they were immigrants, so the president wasn't that far off in what he was talking about. But I think what we have in America is just this weird, and I'd love to try to nuance it somehow, because I think politics is fundamentally deeply important, like the policies and the government and how it operates. It's such a way of seeing like systemic redemption take place. And I think that I think one of the weird things in America is that our revivals have never penetrated the function of society's life. It's been separated, like, you can have a revival in the camps, but then you can still, own slaves and treat them poorly. I think that's anyway. I think that politics is fundamentally important, and that our faith should actually produce people that are being discipled and are involved in local and national government. Like that's just really, really important. But then on the same side, that our political parties are religion. And so it's very interesting, I think, for me, at least, to observe. Like I said, I pastored mostly on the West Coast, the liberal, progressive wing. And they're just like you're saying, Chris, like that is the Christian way to vote. Like there is no way to vote Christian and be Republican. You can't be a Republican and a Christian. If you're a Christian, you have to be a Democrat. And just like the deep like discipleship that happens within those political parties, I think is really, to me, it's like really telling. And so I think there's just this really big challenge. I was even talking to my wife about it this morning, of like upholding the value of politics and saying that we should like pursue, like the church, the people of God should be in the halls of Congress, but also it's not our ultimate hope. And I think that what we do, especially even in gospel-centered cultures, it's like, well, politics is just an idol, throw it away. And it's like, yeah, but just like sometimes my career can be an idol, but I don't just like quit all my jobs, right? Like my house can be an idol, but I don't let the roof rot. And I think that's, I don't know if there's a good nuance there, but that's where at least I see it like lived out when there's no Christian candidate.
Yeah. And if I can add a little bit of that or to that, like it requires us then kind of peeling back a couple layers and really looking at, what the motives are, what the values are that are being discipled. Can you point to, and I'll say any, as if there are more than two major political parties in the U.S. Like you can look at any political party, or any candidate and say, okay, this piece, that piece lines up with something I heard Jesus say, or a value that I believe the scriptures call us to. And then you dig in and go, okay, that one thing is true and it does happen to line up, but not only what else is not lining up, but even like where does that belief, that ideology stem from? Because the motivations matter just as much, and so yeah, it's sending the church out into those aspects of society is what I hear you saying, Brad. Just like we would send them into free film industry in LA, and send them into education if schools ever come back, and whatever else. Like we're sending folks into these different areas to have impact there, without putting our faith in any entity other than Jesus.
Right.
I don't want to dominate. So
yeah, you're good.
It's really quick. Brad said something that it just kind of reminded me of something that I've been feeling. Is I feel this desire just to hit the eject button on the political conversation and hit the eject button altogether. So, I'm just gonna let them eat themselves, and then I'm gonna go over here and do my church thing and proclaim the gospel and reach my neighbors for Jesus. But I think what Brad said is really helpful and something that I've been growing in personally. And whereas I've just kind of like left that to the side, I think, I don't think Jesus was anti-politics. He definitely made a lot of political statements. He may have been apolitical in the sense of like, the kingdom of heaven is his political party, but he definitely had critiques and things to say to the culture at large, the religious community, which was deeply embedded in politics, and also the empire of the day. And so I do think the danger here is for balanced, mindful, thoughtful Christians who love Jesus to go, you know what, I want nothing to do with that place because it's so, it's just so, such a tough mission field, or it's just so ugly. I don't want to go there at all. And I think we do need to be political, but we have to be so careful and guarded that does not trump, no pun intended, our gospel. In fact, there's a guy here who's been helping me a lot think through this, a guy in Victoria, Tim Schindel, who started a ministry called Leading Influence, and they have chaplains that go into our political environment, and they're self-funded missionaries, and they just go in there to build relationships with politicians, pray for them, and just do like a Jeremiah 29, like seek the prosperity of the city, seek the betterment of our country, just by loving our elected officials, sharing the gospel with them, wanting to see them come to Jesus. And that's a tough place to be. That's I just try to imagine a politician who deeply holds on to the gospel, trying to navigate those waters. My goodness, that must be a difficult place to be on mission and to try and bring the gospel to bear.
There's a couple of things that I hear from you guys, though. Almost like there's an assumption there that government kind of works, right? And you can participate in it. So that's not the case in Mexico. The reality is, for 100 years, you can vote for any candidate you want as long as it's from the same party. So people became very cynical, like, hey, bro, politics, government, that's corrupted. Nothing's going to get done through that. And then after that, finally, in the last 20 years, we've had open elections, and we found that politicians are just as corrupt as the previous ones. So there's no way to say, hey, how do we influence that? How do we make that better? It's almost like it's so corrupt, there's no way it would work. I feel like that's part of why there's not a heavy emphasis by evangelical Christians to address those issues. It is expected. I asked a lot of my friends, how do they previously vote? That the politician is going to be stealing public funds. That you need to, grease the wheel. So there's no hope in politics. But one of the things that is happening, though, unfortunately, in my opinion, is that the small percentage of evangelicals are taking playbooks from the American church, using the same language, the same strategies, if you will, the same lens to apply it where a country where that does not work. So it's almost like the vote here for Christians is who is the least corrupt, rather than any single issue in particular. There's no expectation that government will work here. So just a little different context from both of you guys.
Yeah. Would there be any context that you've experienced, Atanasio, where an evangelical could try to bring, evangelical Protestant, let's just say gospel-centered Christian, that someone who would be starting there could enter into any kind of, political office to start to see change and that kind of stuff, even on a local or state level?
In Mexico?
Yeah.
Well, to paint a picture, most of the government has been infiltrated by cartels. So any secular politician that says, I will not take bribes, will end up dead pretty soon.
Wow.
So if you're a Christian that actually wants to exercise biblical justice, you better be prepared to lose your life within a few days. I had someone in our church, he was trying to work for the equivalent of the district attorney for the government. And they told him, look, you're a Christian, you're not going to make it here. So you better be prepared not to get any promotions or go beyond this desk. His wife told him, listen, I want to marry you. This was prior to their marriage. But if you continue this line of work, you're going to end up dead. And I don't want to be a widow. So are there places, I'm assuming there may be some cities, but the reality is you are going to have to compromise your faith, your integrity, if you want to be a Christian in government.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay, thanks for the honesty there. And for those who are paying attention, like if you're feeling this kind of like sense of bleakness that like, oh, okay, so our politics in the US is hard. Oh, turns out politics and division and divisiveness and corruption, even whether overt, like Atanasio was talking about, or more subtle in other nations, that if you're getting the sense of like there's no hope, it's all bleak. I kind of wanted to intentionally, I didn't know where we'd fully go, obviously, but I kind of wanted to intentionally bring us to that point and then kind of pivot and go, if you weren't here at the very beginning, like Stuart Murray talks about how a shift into secular society or pluralistic society, or some of this bleakness that we're feeling, is not necessarily a bad thing. It depends on our response to it to determine whether it's going to stay super bleak or not. And so feel free, those who are attending, start posting questions in the Q&A, because we'll get to them here in a little bit. But I want to kind of move us into that place, like if we're experiencing bleakness and we're saying the answer to the bleakness can't be politics or can't be candidates or that kind of stuff, then as Christians, we believe that the answer is Jesus, and through him and the empowerment of the Spirit, the church, whether it's infiltrating government hallways and that kind of stuff, or being the church rather than relying on government, which one of you referenced a little bit ago. So how can what can ministry and mission look like? Maybe specifically start with this. What can conversations look like during heightened political seasons, and how can God use them for ministry, mission, evangelism, this kind of thing? What are you seeing? Atanasio, you've gotten last a couple times, so if you have any thoughts, I'm going to call on you.
No worries. I think in our context and political seasons and things like that, we start off with basically total depravity. So we speak the gospel like, hey, there's a better king, a better kingdom in the future. There's no way we're going to achieve that here. So it's totally okay. So encouraging people to, and we already know that here, there's no expectation that the government, we can use the government as an arm to implement Christian values. So honestly, the good news for us is in the future. When the King of Kings rules over us, there is no corruption, there is no more death, there's no more, tears and all of that. So it's almost like preparing people to know, look, whatever will happen, whoever gets elected, that's our hope can't be in that person. Our hope is in a person and his kingdom. So it's gospel future.
Yeah. It's good. What about you other guys? How can conversations during heightened political seasons or confusion or that kind of stuff be used by God?
Well, I feel like I find moments like the ones that we find ourselves in now, where they're so politically charged and things are so tenuous, like it feels like a bit of a pot that's about to boil over at any given moment. It perhaps has boiled over a few times now. I feel like these are great moments, because what we're seeing put on display in front of us is what happens when our functional heavens, our functional saviors fail us. So we've had these, visions of grandeur, these notions of a particular ideology that is going to save us. It's going to be our salvation here on earth. And what we're seeing is, that doesn't actually work. They continue to fail. They continue to come up short. And really, what we have right now in the cultural moment we find ourselves in is people just shouting past each other to validate their idea of what the kingdom of heaven would look like should they be able to envision it for themselves. And so I think what's helpful for the Christian in this moment is to, this is where I find a guy like, if you haven't read him or listened to him, Mark Sayers, to be really, really helpful, where he talks about this idea of we're in a post-Christian context, at least in North America, for sure in Canada, and it's coming fast and furious in the States and in parts of USA like where Brad is. We're in a post-Christian context where it's not that we have moved past Christianity. The Judeo-Christian ethic is still very much a part of the water that we swim in, but what we've done is we've abandoned Jesus himself. So he talks about this idea of wanting the kingdom without the king, and that's what we're seeing right now. Is the things that people are ranting, like keyboard warriors are furious about, the people that are protesting are desiring, they're good things in and of themselves: justice, equity, equality, prosperity for people, education, healthcare, all of these things that politicians are going to they're going to campaign on. These are, generally speaking, all good things that in some way, shape, or form align with the gospel. The problem is they want to achieve them without Jesus, who is the ultimate kingdom bringer. And so I think where we have an opportunity as followers of Jesus who live in a different, we're citizens of another kingdom, right? We're not citizens of earth, we're citizens of heaven. We have an opportunity to point out these moments and go, hey, can we show you a better way? Can we show you what true equality looks like here in the family of God? Can we show you what true justice looks like here in the family of God? Can we show you what it really looks like to take care of the widow and the orphan, and not to outsource it to the government who's going to, skim off your money and then through some government program, we're going to actually give our money to take care of the widow and the orphan, and then demonstrate how the kingdom of God can actually, I agree with you, Atanasio, there's a future reality, but there is a present reality to the kingdom. The kingdom is at hand, as Jesus said, and it is coming to bear, and it is our responsibility to push forward the kingdom of God into the kingdom of darkness. And so I think it's a great opportunity. It's dark, like you said, Ben, but there's a great moment here for the church to stand in the gap and say, let me show you what this really looks like. Let me show you the longings of your heart put on display in the person and work of Jesus as he works himself out in our hearts and in our community.
Good, Chris.
Yeah, can I just throw something in there real quick?
Yeah,
that's really helpful, because I think part of it is that what we're describing needs to work in the church. It can't be outsourced to government. That taste of the kingdom happens in the context of our local church, and therefore it can't be outsourced, like Chris said, to governments. So thanks for that, bro. That's really helpful.
Yeah. As you're talking, Chris, it's almost like the picture in Ecclesiastes of I'm trying to find my hope and satisfaction in this, and then I climb up that ladder and realize it's leaning against the wrong wall, and so I climb up this ladder. And so whether it's a policy or a candidate or a political party or an ideal or that kind of stuff, that, you know, again, to give ourselves hook, line, and sinker to anything is going to come up short. And I think the more we can embrace that as a reality, it gives us a voice to know how to go, yeah, this is going to be your experience in the church, out of the church, other people who are just discouraged by this whole conversation, as long as we can know that that's going to increasingly be the future.
And not to rant on here, but I think a helpful distinction for us is to see a difference between the culture war and the kingdom battle that we're fighting. So often Christians want to win the culture war, and in so doing, we lose the kingdom battle that we've been entrusted with. And so, I just think if you have a particular political lens that you see the world through, okay, I'm not going to say that's bad, back to what Brad said, but if that forces you to dislike, potentially even hate somebody who holds a different political view, that's a problem. You're fighting a cultural war, not a kingdom war. You actually should have more in common, if to use American vernacular here. If you're a Republican voter who's a follower of Jesus, you should have more in common with a Democrat Christian than you do with a non-Christian Republican. If that makes sense. Right. You're family, right? And if you don't see the world through that lens, through that rubric, then I think somehow like the gospel has been put to the side, and a different ideology, different story is dominating your worldview. And that's very dangerous, very, very dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Brad.
Yeah, all of that is so good, especially like on the macro and the way to even lead our churches. I think there's also, in my experience, pastorally, there are so many stories and wounds that lurk behind the chargedness of political conversations. And so there's a lot of like stories to like unearth with fathers and mothers and uncles, and abuse and a lack of security or a lack of belonging that gets attached to something else that is not really about like our taxes or our healthcare system or even social like justice reform or anything like that. And I think that what we often miss in politically charged moments, we miss the opportunities to actually like engage in people's like deep stories, where then we can like heal and see the gospel come to bear on several of those moments from people's past or even present wounds that they're just living out through politics, trying to find them healed. And it's really, even like the policy nuances are not the main things that people are really angry about. The anger, it's easier to say you're angry than to say that you're hurt, right? Mm-hmm. But there's just a lot of hurt that's getting expressed in our anger in society that I think is it's tied to things that we've experienced that where Jesus hasn't quite yet been able to get in there and see a revival happen in a soul, whether people aren't yielding to it or they just haven't had that moment yet. And so I think that's a huge opportunity if, as Christians, we can actually listen, not to debate. I know that's like, it's super popular right now to say like, we should just listen to the other sides, which isn't, I don't think we need like, no, tell me more about like your tax proposal and how you want to stimulate the economy. I think it'd be better to be like, oh, how did you get like, oh, where have you found that in your life before? Like what causes you to feel so angry about this? And just to be so blunt, like so much of what I've experienced is the thing beneath all of that is a deep father wound that people have. Like their dad was super absent and all he did was watch Fox News, and that's why they hate conservatives, and there's other, but then, you know, everything gets attached onto that, or they were abused as a child, and now they're watching these other people who have done the same thing get elected. And I think that, yeah, there's so much healing opportunity that we have, and that's kind of my interpersonal. Everything else is so true too. Like, and I think that's how we sign up for Kingdoms Without a King. Is there's real stories baked in.
Yeah, and I wanna not miss, because you almost apologize for saying listening to people, and that's and I get it, but also, like, that is, in Proverbs talks about, like, the wise man will draw out the deep waters of people's hearts, and yeah, so often just that one, you know, hey, look beyond the sign in their yard, and before you just immediately paint them the picture that you have, even though you've never talked to that individual. Maybe have a little bit of a conversation as part of what you're saying.
Right. Yeah. And that's key, like drawing out the heart, not drawing out the like political stances, which I think is all we do with listening at the moment. So that's, I think we need it, because I'll give an example of someone very close to me. You know, my wife has a hard time with our current president, not for any policies that he's done, but because of how he talks about immigrants. And she is an immigrant. And so and her family are all immigrants. And she grew up feeling like she didn't belong, and that there was no place for her. And so it's deeply, like, that's why it's personal. What might explode might be like, oh, I don't like, you know, this tweet or this whatever, but like the deep personal thing is actually attached to her own story. And that any persuasion about politics will not help her, other than like, no, you have a father and there's a kingdom that you belong to. You are a sojourner in this world, but you belong to an everlasting kingdom that's actually present and coming today. And so I think that's the kind of listening we need to do.
Yeah. And that goes so far. That's some of the uniqueness to what followers of Jesus can bring to the table. Like, it is really good advice to go use your voice and vote. Yes, like there's a lot of places we don't get that opportunity. And to a brief conversation you and I had yesterday, Brad, like there's rights that are worth fighting for. So yes, but also that could be said to anyone of any or no belief, who's given that freedom. And some of what you're talking about of listening, and then doing what all three of you have now done, is going like, let's actually truly help see how, when you find that this is leaning against the wrong wall, as we uncover the heart, and then help redirect and go, look, here's how Jesus is actually viscerally good news, not to politics as a box and package, but to this wound that you're experiencing, or to this struggle that you're having. Jesus goes far beyond the yard sign. The yard sign becomes the symptom, if in my mind, is how I'm picturing it, to a deeper diagnosis that Jesus is the only answer to.
Yeah.
Last moments here, but any other advice, experiences that you've seen, that churches in the U.S. can learn from as we become increasingly pluralist as a nation? Or, to say it another way, what does ministry and mission look like in a post-Christendom culture?
I mean, I think for me, my last word would be, and it's more a word to myself, it's like a confession or repentance. Like, we have not as a church family had this conversation. We have not, maybe like little, sidebars and sermons, but we have not discipled our people well, how to think, or to engage this on a discipleship level. I mean, I think we're always giving our people a theological vision for what it means to live in the world, and so we've done that. But this area specifically, conversations like the one we're having right now, we have not done that well. And so, you know, I'm coming away from this conversation like, oh, maybe we need to do some, especially right now, some training and just have some long form conversations with our people around what it looks like to be the people of God, you know, in this moment, and specifically with regards to, you know, the political climate we find ourselves in. So I'd say for me and maybe for others out there, like, disciple your people. I need to disciple my people in this better. I shouldn't see our people, you know, sharing posts of our governmental leaders and speaking poorly of them. That's not of Jesus. And so how do we disciple other people in that regard?
Yeah, I love that you're turning the opportunity into discipleship. It's good. Either of you other two, as we start to wrap up?
Just the last thing on that one, and you know, as Chris was speaking about that, I think a heavier emphasis on gospel fluency and politics. You know, what is it that we're looking for, yearning for, and how does the gospel address that? So, hey, there might be a book in that, guys.
Yeah, I think, one just sort of fleeting thought that everyone can chew on later is, I think it's important for the American church, particularly over the next decade or 10 weeks until there's an election, is to actually define what persecution would look like for people, so that our churches and our disciples have a clear understanding of what is and isn't persecution, so they can navigate a world where that could be very present and real, but also kind of navigate the motivations for why that might be happening to them or whatnot. Because there are real circumstances where that happens, but I think as things unfold in our society, I think that's going to be a big piece for people to understand. And then super unrelated, I was going to talk about the Saturate membership because Ben asked me to. We have a brand new user experience for people who are members of Saturate. Atanasio helped develop that a lot, as well as Sarah and Sunny and our great team. But it's a great, it's more like Netflix, I guess, or Disney Plus. It won't have the same addictive qualities. So you're not just going to be like, oh, show me that next video of Jeff. Show me that next video of Jeff. Maybe that's your thing, but probably won't happen. But what it is we've allowed, made it so that people can find all of the resources that they're looking for. Also, everything we ever published is now in the membership. So it's a huge, huge value right now. And we did that because church is more. This stuff is super important. And we want to make sure that we're giving church leaders all of the stuff that we have to give, not everything that you need, but giving you everything that we've got.
Yeah, that's great. And Brad transitioned us into our wrap up. So
sorry.
Yeah, no, that's good. There are loads of resources for free as well for non-members, and past webinars. And Mike Sullivan, who's one of our Soma pastors in the Boston area, has written a series of blog posts on Jesus and politics that run parallel to some of these webinars. And also that completely redesigned membership experience that Brad just mentioned is at saturatetheworld.com/membership. And then in 2 weeks from today, we're going to have our last Gospel and Politics webinar for the summer. And really it dovetails with where God kind of brought our conversation toward the end, into discipleship and into getting into people's stories and listening well. We kind of themed it around the idea that it's easier to love people who think like us. It's not always easy to love people who think like us, but it's often easier to love people who think like us. And so the question that Jeff Vanderstelt and Bob Roberts are going to be joining me for is how do Christians love our political enemies? And I'll use enemies in quotation marks and hope that that's a strong term. but sometimes in election years, it doesn't feel like that's that strong of a term. It feels like we're actually enemies to one another. So what's it look like for Christians to love our political enemies? That's 2 weeks from today, August 18th at 9 a.m. Pacific, 12 p.m. Eastern. Guys, thank you so much for joining me. Any last minute things you want to hurl out there?
Great to be here. Thanks, Ben.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for honesty. Thank you for sharing your experiences and helping shape what feels a little bit maybe of a theoretical conversation. Of the 4 webinars, probably the most potentially theoretical, but I don't know that it's nearly as theoretical as it may seem. I think it's much more of a tangible need that the church has in many cities and many contexts across the U.S. and beyond. That's really helpful. You guys were really helpful to help church leaders press into these realities. So thank you. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, guys. See y'all.
Bye.